The American entry into the ground war in the European-African theater began with Operation Torch in November 1942. This operation represented the first massive combined Allied undertaking of the war and the inaugural major ground engagement by U.S. forces. The U.S. troops landed on the North African coast, primarily under the optimistic, yet entirely untested belief that their modern equipment, particularly the reliable M4 Sherman tank and their powerful logistics, would guarantee a swift victory against Axis forces they presumed to be demoralized or inferior. However, this high confidence was dangerously misplaced, based almost entirely on abstract pre-war assumptions, and was utterly untested against a veteran enemy. The initial landings were militarily successful, but the subsequent rapid advance toward the German and Italian lines in central Tunisia would soon expose profound, dangerous structural flaws in the entire American military approach and doctrine, setting the stage for disaster. American armored doctrine at the time, having been heavily influenced by optimistic interwar theories and completely lacking recent large-scale combat exposure, emphasized independent tank action, speed, and aggressive breakthroughs. Crucially, this doctrine failed to mandate the necessary seamless coordination of combined arms, meaning infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support often acted as separate, poorly synchronized entities. U.S. tank commanders were narrowly trained to rely on the tank as a singular decisive weapon, often separating them from necessary supporting units like infantry screens and artillery fire control. They lacked the practical combat experience required to integrate supporting infantry, timely artillery fire, and effective tactical air cover. This tactical isolation rendered the armored units highly vulnerable when they encountered cohesive German defenses designed to exploit exactly this kind of tactical separation and exposure. As the U.S. forces confidently advanced into Tunisia, they were immediately and painfully surprised by the overwhelming effectiveness of German anti-tank weaponry. The U.S. belief in the technical superiority of the Sherman was shattered by the ubiquitous presence and power of the formidable 80mm flak gun used in its devastating anti-tank role. The German gunners were masters of rapid concealment and utilized the long, flat sight lines of the desert environment to destroy Shermans from extreme distances, often well beyond 1,500 meters, where the standard American 75mm gun could not effectively return fire or even reliably penetrate the German tanks. This asymmetrical long-range engagement created immediate, paralyzing psychological trauma for the inexperienced crews, who quickly realized that their medium tanks were technically outmatched and highly vulnerable to well-placed German fire. The climax of this initial phase was fatefully dictated by geography. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was fought in a critical mountain gap within the rugged Atlas Mountains of central Tunisia. This narrow, treacherous pass served as a crucial, non-negotiable gateway between the interior plains and the main coastal areas. The terrain itself became a powerful tactical weapon for the Germans. The steep, rocky slopes and restricted valley floor inexorably channeled the American forces, preventing wide flanking maneuvers and forcing them into a predictable, congested column. Field Marshal Rommel exploited this natural choke point to maximum effect, creating pre-sighted kill zones that made mass destruction of the advancing, inexperienced U.S. armor inevitable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, quickly recognized and ruthlessly exploited the organizational disarray and critical inexperience of the American II Corps. He launched the decisive counterattack in February 1943. Rommel's strategy was bold, aggressive, and surgically precise. He used a strong armored thrust, spearheaded by seasoned, cohesive tank divisions, to exploit the weak center of the overextended American lines. Rommel employed concentrated German tanks and motorized infantry to execute a fluid, coordinated mobile defense, rapidly overwhelming the unprepared U.S. infantry and armor that were fighting isolated and without effective artillery coordination. Rommel's tactical genius transformed the engagement from a simple defensive action into a sweeping, catastrophic rout of the U.S. forces. The performance of the 1st Armored Division, which was supposed to be the most proficient American unit, was particularly catastrophic. Having been positioned as the spearhead of the U.S. force, they suffered the brutal brunt of Rommel's attack. Their initial armored charges were launched piecemeal, without adequate reconnaissance or necessary support, allowing German forces to systematically isolate and destroy U.S. tank columns one by one. Crews often abandoned their Shermans when the first catastrophic hit was sustained, revealing a complete lack of unit cohesion and a devastating breakdown of morale under the shock of first combat experience against a superior opponent. Their heavy, rapid losses contributed massively to the overall magnitude of the defeat. The immediate cost of the Kasserine defeat was staggering and publicly humiliating. In less than a single week of brutal fighting, American forces suffered over 6,000 casualties, a horrifying mix of killed, wounded, and captured, representing the highest casualty rate the U.S. Army sustained in the entire European-African theater up to that point. Crucial equipment losses were staggering, including nearly 200 tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces that fell into German hands or were destroyed by concentrated fire. The sheer scale of the loss served as a severe public humiliation for the American High Command, forcing the Allied High Command and the American public to confront the undeniable reality that their forces were simply not prepared for the rigors of modern mobile warfare. The term Patton's Penguins, a crushing moniker of deep derision often used by seasoned German forces, was specifically employed to mock the perceived stiffness, tactical awkwardness, and overall lack of fluid mobility of the American troops in the unfamiliar desert environment. The GIs, clad in heavy, cumbersome field gear and new, ill-suited uniforms, were frequently observed moving clumsily, performing maneuvers stiffly, and seeming generally confused and out of place in the intense North African heat and deep sand, leading to the visual comparison with penguins waddling stiffly out of their element. The nickname powerfully symbolized the German perception of the U.S. forces as clumsy, slow, and tactically rigid, hopelessly unprepared for the fluid, rapid, mobile warfare that had been perfected by Rommel's veteran tank divisions. The sheer magnitude and public nature of the Kasserine defeat demanded immediate, comprehensive, and radical change from the very highest levels of the Allied command structure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander-in-Chief, recognized that the failure was primarily one of structural leadership and insufficient doctrine and training, not merely a fault of individual soldiers or equipment. He was adamant that the entire American command structure in North Africa needed a complete, painful overhaul. Eisenhower's response was swift and uncompromising. The commanders directly responsible for the rout were immediately relieved of duty, and he sought a new, aggressive leader who could restore discipline, instill tactical aggression, and salvage the American image. Eisenhower's choice for the new emergency commander of the severely battered Tattoo Corps was the highly aggressive, uncompromising, and famously driven General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton was viewed as the complete antithesis of the cautious and indecisive leadership that had failed so miserably at Kasserine. Patton was given a singular, brutal mandate: immediately halt the humiliation and rout, forcefully restore absolute military order, and violently instill aggressive professional combat discipline into the surviving tank crews and infantry. Patton's arrival marked an instantaneous, definitive turning point in the campaign, signaling the decisive end of tactical complacency and the necessary beginning of a harsh, unforgiving reckoning for the entire American armored force structure. Patton immediately initiated a notorious and widely publicized reign of ruthless, uncompromising discipline. His very first action was to establish an absolute environment of total accountability across the entire Corps. He famously introduced a zero-tolerance policy for lax behavior, including a documented shoot-to-kill order for sentries who failed to remain fully alert on watch, instantly establishing an atmosphere where vigilance and military bearing were paramount. He enforced stringent and unwavering rules regarding the mandatory wearing of clean uniforms, mandatory saluting, and strict adherence to basic military bearing, operating under the fierce belief that superficial military order was the essential prerequisite and foundation for underlying tactical effectiveness, a necessary unit cohesion in combat. Patton worked tirelessly, day and night, to rebuild the tank crew's shattered confidence and forcefully instill the aggressive ethos he believed was essential for achieving battlefield victory. He personally visited units at the front lines, speaking bluntly and unforgivingly about their failings, but simultaneously demanding they focus only on the future. He constantly emphasized the famous quote, "The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his." By linking strict professional discipline directly with professional effectiveness, he aimed to transform the crippling fear of the enemy into a resolute pride in military proficiency, ensuring that the tank crews would fight with offensive determination rather than defensive caution. Beyond simply enforcing rigid discipline, Patton immediately and comprehensively overhauled the flawed American armored doctrine that had led directly to the Kasserine disaster. He mandated rigorous and realistic combined arms training, ruthlessly forcing tank crews to work closely and communicate seamlessly with supporting infantry units, artillery spotters, and combat engineers. The key change was the fundamental recognition that the Sherman was only effective when supported by concentrated artillery fire to suppress German anti-tank defenses and infantry to protect the tanks against close-range ambushes. This crucial shift directly countered Rommel's effective strategy of separating U.S. units. Patton also emphasized the critical importance of secure, continuous communication across all units, ensuring that commanders could react instantly and effectively to shifting battlefield conditions, unlike the slow, disorganized responses that defined Kasserine. He demanded extreme tactical flexibility, teaching commanders to use the Sherman's superior speed and agility for rapid flanking maneuvers and quick repositioning, a necessary tacit acknowledgement of the immutable German advantage in frontal armor. This strategic shift from relying on assumed technical superiority to fully integrated, aggressive and flexible tactics, was the true, hard-won and bloody lesson of Kasserine Pass. The Kasserine defeat also confirmed the urgent, non-negotiable need for dedicated anti-tank firepower in the U.S. arsenal. While not directly commanded by Patton, the tank destroyer TD battalions played a crucial role in the immediate doctrinal shift. Equipped with mobile, open-topped vehicles like the M10 Wolverine, these units were trained specifically to hunt and ambush German heavy tanks using highly powerful armor-piercing guns. The TDs provided the critical long-range armor penetration that the standard 75mm Sherman desperately lacked, adding a vital new layer to the American combined arms strategy. Patton's reformed II Corps received its first true combat test shortly after Kasserine. Now fighting with renewed professionalism, restored confidence, and a clear tactical plan, the American forces successfully drove the German and Italian forces out of their positions in several small but significant engagements. The victories were achieved through the seamless and immediate application of the new combined arms doctrine, with coordinated artillery and infantry support, preventing the isolation and exposure that Rommel had previously exploited. The tank crews, though still using the same Shermans, demonstrated their massive, life-saving leap in tactical competence and morale. The momentum gained under Patton's command was instrumental in the successful final phases of the North African campaign. The Descenders Corps successfully participated in the final push that trapped the remaining Axis forces against the Mediterranean Sea. The campaign culminated dramatically in May 1943 with the mass surrender of nearly 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. The once derided Patton's Penguins had been successfully forged into a hardened, effective fighting force, having directly contributed to one of the largest Axis surrenders of the entire war. The North African campaign served as an indispensable, albeit extremely high-cost, operational training ground for the entire U.S. Army. The sheer magnitude of the initial failures forced the High Command to acknowledge and address deep-seated issues that would have proven absolutely fatal later in Europe. The costly, bloody lessons learned about logistics, anti-tank warfare, the effective use of artillery, and the critical necessity of combined arms under the harsh tutelage of Rommel proved utterly invaluable, accelerating the American military's maturity by several crucial years. Patton's success in restoring and transforming the Second Corps was so immediate and undeniable that General Eisenhower quickly reassigned him to a higher profile, crucial role, commanding the American forces for the massive invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. His tenure in North Africa was intensely short, only 30 days, but profoundly transformative. He took a broken, demoralized cause and, through sheer force of will, harsh discipline, and rigorous doctrinal reform, forged it into a unit prepared for the immense, impending challenges that lay ahead in the European theater. The painful, life-saving lessons of Kasserine Pass traveled with him directly to Europe. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, though initially a severe military defeat and moment of public humiliation, is ironically remembered today as the most vital catalyst for American military modernization in World War II. The necessary, rapid evolution in command structure, tactical doctrine, and professional training standards that resulted ensured that when the U.S. armored forces landed in Normandy in 1944, they were equipped not just with reliable tanks, but with the necessary doctrinal framework and hardened leadership to ultimately win the war. The defeat at Kasserine was the brutal, necessary price of learning to win.